Glenn Lockley's exhibition Urban Fragments references the everyday peripheral images in the city, which often go disregarded or unnoticed. These fragments are often triggers for subliminal memory, in the way that a scent or a song can conjure up the transcendent past. I'm Vandana Ram, Bankstown Arts Centre Director, and I'm speaking with Glenn about his current exhibition at the Arts Centre. Thanks for joining me, Glenn.
Thank you, Vandana.
Your work draws the viewer in to reconsider ordinary moments as we move through the city, whether it's on the train to work or walking past a construction site near the shops. What first inspired you to re-examine and to kind of elevate these everyday moments?
Well, I think my practice has always been, or probably for the last decade or so, I've been about the working class, about the situation of working in places in the city, in factories, in whatnot, and I guess it's now progressed to, the commute between. So I believe that a lot of these images that I come up with are images that people experience every day, don't notice, but somehow they're stored in their heads. And so I guess with these images, I'm not just trying to get people to see them and go, oh, I recognise that, but it actually maybe perhaps reminds them of those boring trips for 10 years that they did or whatever, you know. So it's nice when art sort of transcends you without you intending to go there, you know.
And where did that actually begin? Like you said, you started talking about the working class. Is that coming from something that's particularly, relevant to your own lived experience? Or?
Well, we moved into Padstow Heights in 1970. And it was very much a working class, rugby league loving, Labor Party voting, fibro house inhabited area. Certainly not the cultural diversity that it has now. And my father also had a factory manufacturing furniture in Alexandria in the city. So there's a city part and there's a Padstow, Bankstown region area sort of tied up. And, you know, it was an interesting, his father had it before him, so we've sort of they'd been manufacturing furniture since the beginning of the century. And he employed Italian migrants and Irish migrants. And so I think there was a sense of culture there that sort of embedded itself, because as a child, you know, I was there all the time and that was sort of my playground, that factory. So I don't think I did my first urban industrial painting until 2008, and in another interview, remarkably, it was the year my father had died, so obviously, you know, it made me sort of reassess that part of my history without me even realising it.
Or some kind of testimonial to him, perhaps?
I think so, yeah. I think it just brings it all home, you know. I think, he's gone, and then suddenly you cling to what he's left behind, which is his history.
And you were talking about, so your own cultural background as well is part of that story? So
Well, true, yeah. Well, we were Chinese immigrants. Not sure, probably late 1800s, early 1900s. Yeah, it was an amazing thing to come here with no language and then have your own factory and employ people at a time, you know, I guess it wasn't easy to assimilate, even if you came here with the language and whatnot, or, you know, or with white skin, you know. So, I think that plays an important role in all that as well. But it's not like the contemporary migrant story. You know, we've been here for generations, you know, but it still is an aspect of being multicultural. You know, I can't speak a word of Chinese. I can order Chinese food in a restaurant. That's as far as it gets.
Yep.
But it's inherent in your genetic memory, I think.
And landing in Padstow in the 1970s to a pretty Anglo kind of space.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think that Padstow, that area actually gives you a sort of sense of place and representation in your art in any other way?
To a degree, I'm not that localised now. I think even when I do a painting of somewhere in Bankstown or Surrey Hills, it doesn't matter where it's from. It's the architecture and it's what it represents. You know, it's a broader sense of humanity. And I guess, you know, these days, I think the suburbs are becoming more and more homogenous anyway, and I think, areas are being gentrified and the whole playing field's being evened up to a degree. We were in New York last year and, we found the same sort of thing, the distinction between Brooklyn and all these places are either mostly Jewish or mostly Italian, and that it's all sort of intermingled now,
The two concertina works on paper have a strong visual reference to place. So they seem to represent like a whole series of images evolving from urban to suburban and rural. Can you tell me a little bit about those works and what inspired them?
Absolutely. I think you had something to do with it.
Okay.
We needed to fill those glass cases. So in a very short amount of time, I thought, of course there's a responsibility to reflect the centre culturally because I'm showing here. But as a matter of convenience, it's also nice to be able to go 5 minutes down the road to get my information. But they are, and I think under the pressure of getting something done quickly, it doesn't necessarily make it less an artwork. It actually hones your focus a lot more into being quite succinct in what you're doing. So I have maybe, with the sculptures as well, I may have had these things rattling around in my head for, maybe a year or so, but it's being forced to manifest itself. So it wasn't that hard to do because the plan was sort of instinctively already there. So, and the nicest thing about making art is that it sort of evolved as I was doing them. So when one was the top drawing, I had gone to Google Maps and got satellite images of the Bankstown area, and just ran a line from the industrial areas, which has the shapes and the composition that is consistent with my work. But I was working in a linear way, and by the time I got to the final panel, I was in the river. And it was sort of accidental, but it's also reflective of the area. Now, I grew up in Padstow Heights, and it was all about the bush and the river. And so, to me, it was a nice sort of illustration of the area. But also the treatment of the work was interesting because it started off quite tight and structural. And then by the time I got to the river, it was quite organic. So it was actually evolved in style as well as the landscape. Mm. And the bottom one was, just a walk along Saltpan Creek boardwalk, between Padstow Heights and Bankstown. And it's pretty much the route I take when I'm on my bike and I want to buy something from Officeworks. So, you can't get much more local than that.
It's functional as well.
Well, that's correct. Yeah, and that's it. It's the work I think has to have either a functional, not just being an aesthetic or trying to represent something that you think's attractive. I think it has to have some functional part in your life as well. That sort of transcends it from being decorative art to being something perhaps more substantial.
Coming from your own experience.
Yeah.
Yep. Hanging on the wall in the gallery is a tessellated cluster of paintings with a wide range of recognisable fragments of the urban landscape. Can you describe some of them and maybe also why they were hung in that particular way, in that kind of cluster? Was there any intention behind that?
Definitely. I had pictured that arrangement, I think, probably a week after we decided that we would have a show here. And in the lack of uniformity of the hang gives people a free rein to start looking at the body of works as from wherever they want. So I'm not forcing people into a navigation of what order to look at things in. So people's eyes will be drawn to something that they may recognise, and everyone's different, so everyone has a different sort of visual memory. As long as it starts there and it moves around.
It'd be interesting to see what people do, like even tracking what they are responding to and why, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that half the work of an exhibition is the work that the viewer does. If you read a great book or something like that, it's your interpretation of the space and how you picture things, which could be entirely different to the way So you don't want you don't want to control the absolute consensus yourself. So, and it was just really pleasing. I thought the hang was great, and it was pretty much how I wanted it to look.
And the other theme that emerges from the work is that daily commute, particularly the works in the window. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how your experience on public transport might be influencing your work then?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of public transport. I just and I sort of think it's also an interesting thing because you go to other countries and like there's no sense of hierarchy. Everyone gets on a train. But here, some people just feel like, oh no, I'd never get on a train. It's almost like a class thing. I think aesthetically, particularly when you're going through the tunnels and things like that, the stark warm light inside the trains in a dark, with a dark train around it is just a really stunning image. But yeah, it seems to be a place where people lose 3/4 of an hour. It's like they sort of. I mean, they can watch Netflix, they can do things like that. Before they used to read the paper, they very rarely interacted. But it was sort of like a weird sort of time in their lives where they just sort of it was the most unproductive time of your life. You just had to get through it and go to the other end. So again, they're staring out the window or they're looking at other trains and things like that. And again, they're those subliminal images that you tend to collect along the way.
And especially when the two trains pass and it's, at night time, it's always just really profound, isn't it? Those
it
little
just catches my eye every time,
Yeah.
But I think, from the time you were a school kid and you caught the train, or you're a teenager and you're going to the city with your friends on a Saturday night, or you're just doing the mundane thing of going to work, it's sort of like an integral part of our culture and our lives, and it can be for entirely different reasons. So.
Yeah, I was really kind of taken by that, what I thought was a Besser block or some sort of concrete thing, and then you revealed to me that it was actually all made from wood and very quickly. So that was kind of interesting. Is that part of that kind of imperative to do something quickly and synthesize that idea? And
again, that's something that I had conceived doing a year and a half ago, and I probably built the box around that time, or the plinth. And I didn't actually wind up rendering it until like 2 days before the show. Again, like when you have these things in your head, the execution's not that, because all the conceptual stuff's been done, so all you've got to do is just execute it. So, yeah, it's a really pure form. It looks like concrete, it looks like a construction, which is what I'm all about. It's sort of like an abstract, minimal version of a building. It's just completely square, you can't sort of make it any less complicated than what it is. So it just represents that. It sort of looks like those towers that you see in the city that are halfway being built. And also, yeah, something that you might see looking out the window of the train. But yeah, there's something textural and ephemeral about the work, and it sort of ties in with the paintings as well.
So here, for almost everyone around the world these days, our perception of the public and private space around us has been kind of recontextualized by the pandemic. So there's constantly changing restrictions and lockdowns, and they've changed our relationship with our homes, our public spaces, parks, public transport. Do you think that it's changed the way you're perceiving these so-called ordinary moments, taking the train?
The odd thing is that's the way I always saw it. A lot of these works have been done years before the pandemic, yet they have that sense of isolation that is sort of relevant now. And so I've sort of felt that the human condition and city living has not been too different to that. I mean, we're manifesting it now in a physical way, but I think mentally there's been that sort of isolation. And so people like Edward Hopper, would paint isolated images of America in the 1950s, and in a sense it's sort of capturing that sort of thing. It's more, I guess it sort of feels, and it's not necessarily a negative thing. I think it's actually a contemplative thing. I don't think a bit of quiet space and a bit of isolation is a bad thing. but certainly the disease is not great.
And especially now with all those little marked seats of the ticks of where you can and can't sit and the masks and so on. So
That's
it's a
right.
very, very different experience.
That's right. It's historically something we've never seen before, and something we've sort of fallen in line with and have to conform with, and happening incredibly quickly. But
I've always been quite excited by the All Stations to Bankstown line, just in terms of the diversity of people and the languages and the kind of experience you have of just, I will tune into the Indian languages, for example. So it's
Yeah.
like you're having these multiple kind of, layers of experience. Like it's a very different experience to going to a North Shore kind of, train line as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think if you go to a venue, or if you go to a shop, or if you go to a cafe, sometimes it's your taste. And so therefore you tend to have similar sorts of patrons. But on a train, it's a means of transport. It's open to everyone. No one picks it because it's their taste. So therefore you get that diversity, and you get to observe that. But it's perceptive, it's perceptive to actually observe that. A lot of people will either be irritated by it, shut it out, or not see it at all. So I think maybe that's the difference between being a creative, is that you're always on the hunt for interesting inspirations and things like that, and generally that'll come from, observing people, observing things, observing light.
And I think just finally, I think there is that kind of dichotomy. You're painting these very urban architectural kind of spaces, but you're also living in Padstow Heights, which you're describing as bush and river and, salt marshes and things like that. So how does that work for you? Like, do you see both worlds, and do they come together? Like,
Not so much in my artwork.
No.
So I've had 3 solo shows back in the 90s and early 2000s. And they were landscapes. They were expressionist landscapes, and I think part of that comes from when I studied. Expressionist landscape was king, and therefore you leave college with that sort of tradition. And I lived in an area where there was, so much material. So I had 3 shows, and then these funny buildings started creeping into the 3rd show. And it didn't seem as though art could, something substantial or something that could be made from that. But I've also found that geometry is a natural sort of leaning towards my visual sort of vocabulary. So that eventually you evolve to whatever is closest to your natural tendencies, and so it has evolved to this. I don't know where it'll go in the next 20 years, but certainly where I am now is closer aesthetically, and the buildings and the urban landscape lends itself to that sort of architecture or picture making.
And I noticed in this exhibition you've actually used some building materials themselves, so little bits of whatever
Fibro, gyprock.
Yeah. So have you done that before?
A few of those fibro pieces have been exhibited before, and again it was in Alexandria in a window gallery, So, I think it's authenticity. It's also moving away from, I guess, pristine, perfectly made art. I like that it has a certain authenticity. They're still made to sort of survive. But, I guess it's that sort of, almost that poverty sort of aspect to art, I just think there's something there to relate to in there,
It's real.
Yeah, it's real, yeah.
And do you do little sketches while you're in the train, or where do you mainly work? Do you have a studio space?
I've got a studio space, yeah.
Yep.
I work from home, and I work primarily from photographs. I take a lot. So, and I sort of do pride myself of being a bit of a photographer. And the thing about being a photographer or taking good images has nothing to do with great equipment or even great technique. It's actually being able to capture something evocative. to actually recognise when a composition works. So a lot of the times my paintings will come from a fragment of a photograph that I can see that has the potential to be a strong work. And so yes, a lot of photographers have seen my work and sort of said there's a photographic eye in the way you're constructing your work. So
it's like a little zoom or something.
Yeah. It's just picking out the most interesting part and then making something of that.
Glenn Lockley's exhibition Urban Fragments is currently showing at Bankstown Arts Centre. You can see Glenn's work at the Arts Centre during opening hours, Tuesday to Friday from 10 to 3, or you can visit the digital exhibition, including a 360-degree tour on our website. Thank you for joining me in the Arts Centre studios, Glenn.
Thank you, Vandana.